The enduring series of Rocky films began in 1976 and are still being made, with Creed II due out in 2018. Rocky is a much-loved series, and like Rambo, is responsible for many of the defining films of Sylvester Stallone's career. Here I'm looking at how the Rocky films have changed over time. Stallone wrote all of the films except Creed, the latest film, released in 2015. And he directed Rocky 2, 3 and 4, and of course stars as Rocky himself, an amateur boxer and hired goon, who's really going nowhere but Palookaville. He's a nice guy really, but he's a bum.
You got heart, but you fight like a goddamn ape. Nothing special about you, you never got your nose busted. Well, leave it that way, nice and pretty, and what's left of your mind.
That all changes when reigning heavyweight boxing champion Apollo Creed, played by Carl You've Got Yourself a Stu Weathers, comes into the picture. He's spent a fortune promoting a fight that can no longer go ahead because his opponent has been injured, and with very few other boxers ready or able to take their place, Creed decides to fight a complete unknown under the guise of providing an opportunity for a normal schlub, meaning his expensive promoting won't go to waste. That someone is of course Rocky Balboa, and the film follows Rocky as he trains for his fight, on the way dating and falling in love with Adrian, played by Talia Shire, and getting called a bum by the fantastically salty trainer Mick, played by Burgess Meredith. The film plays with many of the beats you might expect from an underdog or rags to riches film. Rocky has to come from nothing and defeat the greatest heavyweight there is, but it's very different in some aspects of its story. The beginning of the film almost feels like a gritty drama. Rocky's neighbourhood is a dump. There's hobos drinking and singing. And he has to escort little Marie home so people don't think that she's a
whore. You understand? Whore.
I mention little Marie because later she's Rocky's love interest. 30 years later. Rocky finally manages to get the painfully shy Adrian to go out with him, despite her brother, Paulie, played by Burt Young, not making it easy. What's unusual is this relationship never gets upset. They go out and everything's fine. He doesn't win her at the end, there's no misunderstanding for him to make up for, there's no obstacle. So too is this film unusual in that it doesn't really have an antagonist. There's Apollo Creed, Rocky's opponent, a bit of a showboating ass, but he never plays any dirty tricks on Rocky. He never shafts him. He's a motor mouth for sure, but he's not really dislikable. And what's really different about this film, and here's your first spoiler by the way, is Rocky doesn't even win the match at the end. Creed wins on a split decision. But the thing is it doesn't really matter. Rocky came very close to beating Creed. He gave it his best, and that's really what this film is about. It's not about winning, it's not about revenge. Rocky is about rising to the challenge. Throughout the entire series, it's emphasised that Rocky boxes for the love of the sport. There are times where he's forced to do it when he doesn't want to, but generally Rocky teaches and trains because he likes those things. He doesn't make any speeches about how he's the best in the world. He doesn't talk about how that belt should be his. He doesn't belittle his opponent. I kind of wonder if Rocky's disposition was written as a wishful response to the loud and obnoxious wars of words we often see in real-life weigh-ins. That's just speculation though. However, I think it's worth noting that many of the series' entries do have a lot of humour.
I want to let my brother know where I am.
Well, I'll call you brother, if that's the problem.
Yo, Paulie, your sister's with me. I'll call you back later.
Stallone wrote the script in 3.5 days, although it was rewritten a number of times, and the film is quite different to the original draft. It was picked up by United Artists, with Stallone requesting he be given the lead from producers Irwin Winkles and Robert Chartoff. Stallone wouldn't go on to star in Rambo for 6 more years, and the best-known film he was in, up until Rocky, was Death Race 2000, which he wasn't the lead of. So Stallone was pretty much unknown, and he was a risk, but UA were interested. They at first considered giving it a $2 million budget, but Stallone continued to insist that he star. So UA agreed after slashing the budget in half, and on the condition Stallone take no fee for writing. Rocky was directed by John G. Avildsen, who directed Rocky V. The film cost a little over $1 million, with a further $4.2 million spent on prints and advertising. The producers even mortgaged their homes to cover the last little bit of the budget, as UA had promised $1 million and not a cent more. Rocky took the Oscar for Best Picture, Best Director and Best Editing. Worldwide, it took $225 million at the box office. It was the highest grossing film of 1976. You can see why there are 6 more. Rocky II was directed by Sylvester Stallone. Avildsen declined the job because he was directing Saturday Night Fever. So Stallone jumped at the chance to direct his second film, his first being Paradise Alley. I think Stallone did a really good job in making sure that Rocky II had the same tone as Rocky I, and I think as a series it's probably one of the most congruent tonally, but more on that later. It picks up right where Rocky I left off, with Rocky being taken to hospital. Creed, in Hospital 2, because they did fight 15 rounds, is indignant. He didn't want to lose. And right from this point, we know where the film is going.
Stallion, how is the story? You got a dog skull, Stallion. You're lucky. So lucky. What you did was a miracle. You're the luckiest man on the face of the earth. I want you to know that, Stallion.
The film then follows Rocky and Adrian as they enjoy success, or as Rocky enjoys success and Adrian worries that they're spending too much. Which they are. Rocky doesn't want to fight anymore, and he has an injury to his eye which limits his peripheral vision, and he isn't very good at selling out.
In the morning, I splash it on, and it surrounds my face with class.
Cut!
Again, speculation on my part, but I think the parts of the movie where Rocky has to deal with fame, endorsements, and himself becoming a product probably reflect Stallone's own experiences. Rocky doesn't want another fight with Creed, but Creed has something to prove. Married to Adrian, and with a baby on the way, Rocky gets a job packing meat. Eventually, he does decide to face Creed, and take a fat paycheck in the process. So they begin training, in a way very similar to the first film. And hey, do you remember when Mick got addicted to speed?
You gotta get speed. Demon speed. Speed's what we need. We need greasy, fast speed.
The film somewhat ventures into soap opera when best brother in the world, Paulie, shouts at Adrian and she ends up giving birth to a healthy baby but also ending up in a coma, which presents Rocky with something to worry about and pose a possibility to the audience that he might not win again. But Adrian wakes up and all that's left is the actual fight. I think the fight in Rocky II is probably my favourite of the series. I really like the way that it often feels as though we're watching it through TV, and I think that they choreographed the ebb and flow of boxing really well. Of course, it follows the basic formula of all these films. One of the fighters starts off weak, and usually completely underestimated, before brutally overcoming their opponent. Of course, Rocky wins and becomes the heavyweight champion. On a production budget of $7 million, this film brought in $200 million worldwide. Stallone began work on the script for Rocky III immediately after completing Rocky II. It begins with Eye of the Tiger, now famously associated with Rocky. However, the original music was meant to be the specifically composed You're the Best by Joe Esposito. That track was later used in The Karate Kid, directed by John G. Avildsen. The film, I'd argue, is a little flabbier, but not to the point where it's really detrimental. If you liked the first two, I don't really see a reason not to like this one. Rocky is now heavyweight champion, and is rich and successful. Paulie is jealous of Rocky.
You know, I always give you. I give you. What do? You buy a new house? You move Mick in, right? Did you ask me? Is there something matter with me?
And again, I feel as though that's come from Stallone's own experiences. Again, the opponents here are the opposite of modest and gracious. The first is Hulk Hogan as Thunderlips, a nuts wrestler who it turns out is really alright, who Rocky fights in a charity exhibition. It's kind of silly, but you can see they're having fun, especially Hulk Hogan. The real opponent, much more antagonistic than Creed, is the jibber-jabbering Mr. T, making his film debut as Clubber Lang, an unpleasant but determined man who wants to challenge Rocky. So now the tables have been turned. Rocky has to become the underdog again if the film's going to follow the same formula. When Rocky and Lang meet, we know this is going to be bad for Rocky. The fight starts 40 minutes into the film, and this is not a 60-minute movie. Rocky gets destroyed, and there's a lesson here again about rising to the challenge. He's a showboater now, like Creed. He doesn't have the passion.
You had that eye of the tiger, man, the edge. And now you got to get it back, and the way to get it back is to go back to the beginning.
But Rocky loses both the heavyweight belt and his trainer. Yes, Mick dies, and it's a little bit the fault of Lang. So again, we go through the same motions as before, but this time with Creed training Rocky. A turn of events that I think work really well, especially given the message of sportsmanship. There's even a moment where Creed listens to Lang, showing off in much the same way that Creed used to. It's a moment where Apollo Creed realises in his younger days he may have been a bit of a dick.
Come on, wanna jump? Jump! Come on! Come on, Creed! Come on! Yeah, come on!
With the help of Creed, Rocky gets his mojo back, and you guessed it, his heavyweight title. Rocky III is the second best performing film of the series, raking in $270 million at the box office worldwide. Rocky IV is where I think we start to see the series significantly changing. The story isn't incredibly different from what we've seen before, but it does feel different. Dolph Lundgren is Ivan Drago. Russian boxing machine come to the US to prove his mettle, and the mettle of the immortal USSR too. Apollo Creed decides to show him the superiority of America. They pretty much say that. It's very political in a very basic way. Of course, this is a Rocky film, and Creed, the Count of Monte Cristo himself, doesn't win. In fact, he's killed in the ring. And we set up what I would describe as the only real antagonist in any of the Rocky series, maybe with the exception of George Washington Duke.
If he dies, he dies.
Clubber Lang was obnoxious for sure, and as we'll see, George Washington Duke is snake-like and irritating. But whilst Clubber Lang may have given Mick a heart attack, he didn't punch him to death. This film becomes not so much an underdog story, rather than a story of avenging the death of a friend. So the revenge aspect is a bit different for sure, as is the fact that Rocky goes to Russia to train, and he has his final fight against Drago in Moscow. But those things aren't as different as the direction. With Stallone writing and directing still, I'm not really sure why the film ended up the way it did. 32% of this film is montage. I know that sounds as though I've just made it up, but someone has counted the minutes spent in montage. The link is in the description. There are 8 montages. The film is 91 minutes long, and just under 30 minutes are montage, with 24 of those accounting for the last 50 of the movie. Now, I like James Brown, but Living in America is performed in its entirety for Creed's dramatic entrance. James Brown is also responsible for this thing, a robot that apparently would tour with him. It becomes a sort of live-in butler to Rocky, and possibly Paulie's only love interest in the entire series.
You know how tobacco stains your teeth. If I've told you once, I've told you 1,000 times.
Hey, stop busting my chops.
The robot is just there. It doesn't serve a purpose at all, except for maybe when Adrian goes to Russia to visit Rocky. I guess it's the robot that looks after the kid. Anyway, Rocky beats Drago and also is responsible for Perestroika and Glasnost.
Trying to say is that if I can change,
Я думаю, что каждый тоже изменился сегодня.
and you can change.
The film was the most successful financially, raking in $300 million. And although it is clearly bloated and packed with filler, and although it feels as though Stallone didn't really know what he wanted to do with it, I feel as though it does have a special place in fans' hearts. It's almost like a parody, or a playful attempt to make this film the most Rocky of the series. I'd say it's the most ridiculous of all the films, maybe not in terms of what happens, but certainly in terms of tone. Rocky V too is an interesting change in that it highlights some of the dangers of boxing. Yes, of course, Creed dying does too, but here it's more about the long-term effects. The issue Rocky V raises feels more poignant because I think most people assume Creed dying is a freak event, whereas what we see here is the toll that affects many boxers and other athletes later in life. Rocky has brain damage, so despite Paulie somehow losing all of Rocky's money, Rocky can't just get back into the ring without really risking his life. Early on, we meet flamboyant irritant George Washington Duke.
Then a long shot comeback of a down on his luck pure Snow White underdog. Not like your Mark Twain once said, virtue has never been as respectable as money.
Just as Creed was clearly based on, or at least informed by, Muhammad Ali, George Washington Duke is clearly based on real-life boxing promoter Don King. If you've got 10 minutes to spare and you fancy reading an interesting Wikipedia article, look him up. I guess there aren't a lot of people who've been sued by Lennox Lewis, Mike Tyson and Muhammad Ali. Anyway, Duke wants Rocky to fight the new heavyweight champion, Union Kane, who's now assumed Rocky's title without ever beating him. Unable to do that because of his health, and penniless, the Balboas are forced to move back to Skid Row, and Rocky has to sell much of his stuff. The love of the sport this time manifests itself in Rocky through training rather than being trained. He finds a young man who he thinks he could make a good boxer out of, Tommy Gunn, played by Tommy Morrison. Italian Stallion, Apollo Creed, Thunderlips, Clubber Lang, Tommy Gunn, later Adonis. This series has a real thing for porn names, although I guess Clubber Lang sounds more like Eurodisco. The film focuses on Rocky training Gunn, but also how this interferes with his relationship with his own son, Robert, played by his own real-life son, Sage Stallone. It also provides, I think, the strongest comment on the boxing industry in the entire series, especially when Duke poaches Gunn from Rocky, under the guise of making Duke rich, but really to exploit him as quickly as possible.
Oh, you know, this is a dirty business. It's full of these thieves and gangsters, you know, and they promise every good young fighter who comes along, they promise them the world. Look, Tommy, that's the way this business is run. Look, the guy's like Duke. You know what he is? He's a vampire. He's living off your blood, Tommy.
Rocky reconciles with his son, and the film ends with the press convincing Gunn that his victory over Union Kane is a hollow one, and that Rocky is still the best fighter there is. So Rocky and Gunn face off in a street brawl, where Rocky wins pretty easily. And then we've got this.
Come on, Pug. Touch me now, Sue.
The film is again directed by Avildsen, and whilst I think it has a tighter presentation than Rocky IV, I'm not sure Rocky V lives up to the first three. If nothing more than because of the inevitable fact that, by the time we as an audience get to Rocky V, we've really seen everything it has to offer before. I think the moment that Rocky punches Duke in the face and gives him his just desserts could have been so much more righteous and satisfying. It just feels a little bit hollow. We just weren't exposed to Duke or his evil deeds enough. The relationship between Rocky and Gunn is never fully fleshed out. There's a point where Rocky wants to give Gunn a necklace Mick gave him, and it's never really clear why that is, as although Rocky trains Gunn and Gunn shares some of his life story, we never really see them bond. Although the film does have the most romantic line ever uttered.
Well, maybe I'll take you upstairs and violate you like a parking meter.
In the original script, Rocky is killed in his fight with Gunn. He dies in Adrian's arms. Now, I'm not sure that would have made the film better. It would have certainly killed the franchise, unless they did something like Rocky, the Loan Shark Enforcer years. But I do think it would have had a much harder impact. Everyone who worked on Rocky V was probably under the impression that it would be the last film of the series, and as it stands, it feels hollow. Stallone himself was disappointed with the film, but it's one of the reasons Stallone went on to make another. It was the most expensive Rocky film to make and took in the least amount of money. It cost $42 million and made worldwide $120 million, making only $40 million on the American domestic market. Although of its expenses, $15 million of those $42 million were on Stallone's fee. Now obviously there was 16 years between Rocky V and the 6th entry, Rocky Balboa. Rocky Balboa is the start of the series becoming far more sad and using far less jokey one-liners. It really is quite a melancholic rejoining of legendary boxer Rocky. His wife has died. His son is distant and embarrassed by his father.
I changed my plans for tonight.
Well, that'd be great. I'm looking forward to it. Hey, how you doing?
Okay.
Okay.
Stallone says the choice to have Adrian killed off was to create an emotional resonance for Rocky, but it could have also been down to a contractual dispute. It's unclear. Now Adrian's name lives on as the name for the pretty swish restaurant Rocky owns and manages. He bumps into Marie from the first film, now a 40-year-old woman with a son. They have a bit of a romance, but it never goes anywhere, or we never see it do, and it all feels very tragic.
Are you mad because Adrian left you?
She didn't leave, Paul. She died.
Okay.
You know, sometimes it's hard to breathe. You know, I feel like this beast inside me.
All Rocky has now is the dysfunctional Paulie, but it's better than nothing, I guess. ESPN run a simulation between Rocky and current heavyweight Mason Dixon, reminiscent of the 1970 film The Super Fight, featuring Rocky Marciano and Muhammad Ali in a fictional fight. Inspired, Rocky decides to renew his boxing license, perhaps to prove to himself he's still got what it takes, perhaps just for something to fight for. So he's trained by Apollo's old trainer, Duke, not George Washington Duke, just Duke. He reconciles with his son, and he faces Dixon. And what I really like about the fight scenes in this film is that they really do look like you're watching some pay-per-view fight. That's true of the earlier films too. They always look like they could be images coming through very high-quality TV cameras. But here the rest of the film is shot on standard 35mm, and the boxing match is filmed on HD, so it looks like a TV fight of the era would. I know that's only a small thing, but I think it's a really nice touch. So, even though Mason Dixon is apparently in his prime, and he is the heavyweight champion, and although Rocky is in his late 50s, Rocky goes the distance, getting through 15 rounds. He loses by split decision, but just like the first film, it's all about competing. I think the film itself, maybe as I'm describing it, with the huge age discrepancy, sounds a bit ridiculous, and maybe it is, but it would be much more ridiculous if it wasn't for the film's introspective tone. Stallone wrote and directed this one, and I think he did a really good job in making Rocky an aging star, not just superficially, not just with the memories and a few stiff joints, but with all the baggage that comes with getting old. His life isn't really a happy one, and this film feels deeply personal to Stallone. I really do think there's a lot of Stallone in this. Rocky Balboa took in $155 million worldwide, and proved that there very much was still an appetite for Rocky. Creed is the 7th of the Rocky series, and follows Apollo Creed's illegitimate son, Adonis. Why wouldn't his illegitimate son be called Adonis? At this point, it'd be weirder if his son was called Jim Creed. At a young age, Adonis is taken in by Apollo Creed's widow, and raised with all the privileges you might expect, but still dreams of being a boxer. He goes to Philadelphia and meets Rocky, who begins to train him, and at the same time starts a relationship with singer Bianca. Tony Bellew plays Ricky Conlon.
This guy, he's an overnight success, never had a damn fight in his life. He's got this shot because he found that name last night.
The light heavyweight champion looking for one last big fight before he's carted off to jail. And who better to have a big fight with than Apollo Creed's son? It may sound very familiar, and it is. It's kind of a soft reboot in that Rocky now fills the role of Mick, and Creed the role of Rocky. It's very much about passing on the torch. It's also, as with the previous film, quite sad. Paulie has died, and Rocky gets cancer, which he decides not to fight. Rather, he decides it's his time to die too. Stylistically, the film is quite different to earlier entries, and I wish the final fight had been presented more in the TV style of Rocky Balboa. This is the first film in the series not written by Stallone, although I think he clearly influenced its direction. Sage Stallone, who played Rocky's son in Rocky V, died at the very beginning of the pre-production process of Creed in 2012, and I think his death must have had an influence on how this film was made, and must have certainly had an influence on the performance of Sylvester Stallone. Everyone we've seen before in the Rocky series is gone. His son has moved to Vancouver, and they don't speak too often. He's alone. He's old. He's not got long left. Creed is a film I would describe as having nothing wrong with it, but a film that I'm not really invested in, and that's all down to Michael B. Jordan being a perfectly fine actor, but having nowhere near the same screen presence as Stallone. I know a lot of people really like Creed in its entirety, but the parts I really like are watching Stallone portray natural decay. The parts I think carry weight are Rocky staring into his future, and his future is death. It sounds really weird to say that Rocky as a series has endured for so long that Rocky as a person now has to consider his own death. I think it was a good avenue to go down, but I wonder where they're going to go with it in Creed 2. Creed made $173 million at the box office. As I said earlier, I think the films in the Rocky series are very consistent. Sure, some are weaker than others, but there's no Die Hard 5 here, there's no Terminator Genesis, or any sort of film that breaks what Rocky is. The series changes as it has to, with Rocky's age. It toys with politics and commentary on social situations, or fame, or boxing itself. But at its heart, every film in the series is really about the sport, and about the relief of boxing, and about how it sustains. And I don't think that changes. Out of all of the series I've looked at so far, I think Rocky changes a lot on the surface, but least deep down. And I think that's why it remains so popular and celebrated. So that's how I think Rocky has changed over time. I'd love to know what you guys think, and if you have a favourite movie, I'd love to know what that is and why. Join me next time where I'll be discussing Hollywood cynicism, the rise of the high concept film, of the franchise, and of the reboot. Be sure to leave a like. Thank you very much for watching. See you next time.
I show you a trick how to get some speed in them legs.